The frozen breath of Sergeant Thomas Mitchell hung in the crystalline air as he adjusted his rifle strap for the 100th time that morning. December 15th, 1944 had dawned with deceptive tranquility across the Ardennes forest. The kind of silence that made veteran soldiers uneasy. Mitchell had learned to distrust quiet mornings during his 18 months fighting across Europe with the 106th Infantry Division. "Seems too peaceful, don't it, Sarge?" whispered Private Danny O'Sullivan, his youthful face already bearing the premature lines that war etched into boys who'd seen too much. The 19-year-old from Boston had joined Mitchell's squad only 3 weeks earlier. Replacing another kid who'd caught shrapnel outside Aachen, Mitchell nodded grimly, scanning the tree line through his binoculars. Intelligence reports had been sparse lately, but something felt wrong. The Germans had been unusually quiet along this section of the West Wall. Seasoned NCOs like Mitchell knew that quiet Germans were often planning Germans. Lieutenant James Crawford emerged from the command bunker, his clean uniform marking him as one of the replacement officers who'd been flooding in since the heavy casualties at Hirchen Forest. "Sergeant Mitchell, Colonel's called a briefing for only 100 hours. Seems we might be moving up to relieve some units near Sankt Vith." The mention of Sankt Vith made Mitchell's stomach tighten, like he'd heard rumors from communications intercepts about German armor movements, though command insisted the Wehrmacht was finished. Their offensive capabilities broken after the summer's devastating losses in the Falaise Pocket, as referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive work band of brothers. Many American units in the Ardennes sector had grown complacent after months of relatively light resistance. Believing the German army was on the verge of collapse, the morning briefing painted a picture of routine repositioning. Colonel Henderson, a career officer who'd earned his rank through staff work rather than field command, stood before a map dotted with colored pins. "Gentlemen, we're moving the regiment forward to support the 8-Corps sector. Intelligence indicates minimal German presence in our area of operations. This should be a straightforward relief operation." Mitchell exchanged glances with Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski, a Polish-American who'd been fighting since North Africa. Both men had survived too many routine operations to believe in easy missions. Kowalski's weathered hands traced patterns. In the frost on the bunker table, nervous habit Mitchell had noticed before every major engagement. Private First Class Roberto Martinez, squad's radioman, adjusted his heavy equipment pack while muttering prayers in Spanish. The young man from New Mexico had an uncanny ability to sense trouble before it arrived, a talent that had saved the squad more than once. Today, his usual nervous energy seemed amplified. "What's eating you, Martinez?" Mitchell asked quietly as the briefing concluded. "My grandmother always said animals know when storms are coming." "Sarge, haven't seen a single bird this morning, and even the rats in the bunker seem spooked." Mitchell had learned to trust his men's instincts as much as official intelligence reports. As they prepared to move out, he made sure each soldier checked their ammunition twice and carried extra medical supplies. Something told him they'd need every round and bandage they could carry. The column began moving at 1400. Hours, winding through snow-covered paths, toward what command promised would be a quiet sector. None of them knew they were marching directly into the path of Operation Watch on Rhine, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture Antwerp. At 0430 hours on December 16th, 1944, the world exploded. Sergeant Mitchell jolted awake in his foxhole as the first artillery shells screamed, overhead like banshees announcing the apocalypse. The ground shuddered violently, throwing frozen dirt and snow into the air as German cannons unleashed the most concentrated bombardment the Western Front had seen since Normandy. In the span of 90 minutes, over 1,600 German artillery pieces would fire on American positions across an 85-mile front. "Jesus Christ," O'Sullivan screamed, pressing himself against the frozen earth as shrapnel whistled overhead. The young private's helmet had been knocked askew, revealing terror-filled eyes that reflected the orange flashes illuminating the pre-dawn darkness. Mitchell grabbed his radio handset, but static was all that answered his calls. German artillery had severed communication lines throughout the sector, isolating American units, just as Wehrmacht planners had intended. The systematic nature of the bombardment told him this was no probe or diversionary attack. This was the main event. "Martinez, get on the radio and try to raise battalion." Mitchell shouted over the deafening roar. The radio man worked frantically with his equipment. But the careful German targeting had destroyed relay stations and command posts across the front. When the artillery finally lifted at us, an eerie silence settled over the smoking forest. Mitchell raised his head cautiously, then froze at what he saw emerging from the morning mist. Massive shapes materialized between the trees. German Tiger tanks, their long guns pointed directly at American positions. Behind the armor came waves of infantry in winter camouflage. Members of the 6th SS Panzer Army advancing with clockwork precision. These weren't the exhausted Wehrmacht conscripts the Americans had been fighting lately. These were elite SS troops, well-equipped and battle-hardened veterans, pulled from other fronts for this offensive. They're everywhere, Lieutenant Crawford's voice cracked with panic as he stumbled into Mitchell's position, his uniform torn and his left arm hanging useless at his side. The whole line's collapsing. Colonel's dead. Battalion headquarters is overrun. Mitchell felt ice form in his stomach as he assessed their situation. His company had been spread thin along a 2-mile front, standard procedure when facing a supposedly beaten enemy. Now they faced an entire German army group with inadequate ammunition and no communication with higher command. Kowalski, Mitchell called to his fellow NCO. Take your squad and fall back to that ridgeline. Set up interlocking fields of fire. With whatever we've got left, the master sergeant nodded grimly, gathering his remaining men. Half his squad had been casualties in the initial bombardment, including both his machine gun crews. They'd have to make do with rifles and whatever ammunition they could scrounge. As documented in Charles MacDonald's definitive account, A Time for Trumpets, American forces in the Ardennes were caught completely off guard by the German offensive, with many units overrun before they could establish coherent defensive positions. Private Martinez appeared at Mitchell's elbow, his radio finally crackling to life. Through the static came fragments of desperate transmissions from across the front. Double quotes, ... overrun at checkpoint 7, ... Tiger tanks in sector 4, ... Request immediate reinforcement, ... Sarge, Martinez whispered. I'm picking up German transmissions too. They're coordinating a massive breakthrough. This ain't no local attack. Mitchell absorbed this information while watching German infantry advance methodically through the forest. Their tactics were professional and confident, suggesting extensive planning and preparation. These soldiers believed they were winning, and their aggressive movement indicated they had good reason for confidence. All right, listen up. Mitchell addressed his remaining men, about 20 soldiers from what had been a full-strength company 12 hours earlier. We're going to conduct a fighting withdrawal to Sankt Vith. Stay low, conserve ammunition, and help your wounded buddies. You're not beaten yet. Okay. As they began their retreat through the snow-laden forest, Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that they were witnessing history's pivot point. Either American forces would rally and stop this offensive, or the war in Europe might drag on for months longer than anyone had imagined. Behind them, German voices echoed through the trees, growing steadily closer. By December 18th, 1944, Sankt Vith had transformed from a sleepy Belgian crossroads town into a crucial fortress, standing against the German tide. Sergeant Mitchell's depleted squad had joined thousands of other American soldiers streaming into the town's defensive perimeter, creating an impromptu garrison that would determine the fate of the entire Ardennes offensive. Mitchell found himself in the basement of a bombed-out church, sharing space with survivors. From half a dozen different units, the 7th Armored Division had arrived just in time to establish a defensive line. Their Sherman tanks positioned behind hastily constructed roadblocks throughout the town's outskirts. How many effectives do we have? Asked Major Robert Thompson, a staff officer who'd taken command after his regimental commander was killed in the retreat. The major's uniform bore the insignia of the 106th Infantry Division, but his haunted eyes suggested he'd seen more combat in the past 3 days than in his entire previous career. Approximately 800 infantry, sir, reported Captain William Hayes, a company commander whose unit had been decimated during the initial German assault. Plus whatever armor and artillery the 7th Armored brought with them, were critically low on ammunition and medical supplies. Mitchell studied the map spread across a makeshift table constructed from church pews. German forces had surrounded Sanctivith on 3 sides, with only a narrow corridor remaining open to the west. Reconnaissance reports indicated that Wehrmacht units were positioning to close that final escape route within hours. "What about relief forces?" asked Lieutenant Crawford, who'd somehow survived the retreat despite his wounded arm. The young officer had aged years in the past few days, his confident demeanor replaced by grim pragmatism. Major Thompson shook his head grimly. Ninth Army's committed elsewhere, and First Army's dealing with their own problems. General Hodges is trying to stabilize the entire front, but we're on our own for now. Private O'Sullivan appeared at Mitchell's shoulder, his face pale with exhaustion and shock. "Sarge, the Germans are setting up speakers outside the perimeter. They're broadcasting surrender demands in English." Through the basement windows, they could hear amplified voices echoing across the snow-covered streets. "American soldiers, you are surrounded. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Continue fighting and face annihilation." The psychological warfare campaign was having its intended effect on younger soldiers who'd never faced such desperate circumstances. Mitchell noticed several privates exchanging nervous glances, their resolve wavering after 3 days of continuous combat. Master Sergeant Kowalski climbed down the basement stairs, his uniform torn and blood-stained from street fighting, are massing for another assault on the eastern approaches. This looks like at least 2 battalions, supported by assault guns. My boys are running low on anti-tank ammunition. As reported in John Eisenhower's detailed military history, The Bitter Woods. The defense of Sanctivith became one of the most crucial delaying actions of the entire Battle of the Bulge, buying precious time for Allied forces to reorganize their defenses. Mitchell checked his rifle methodically, counting his remaining ammunition. 47 rounds of 30 OS6, plus 2 grenades in his bayonet. Around him, other soldiers performed the same ritual, preparing for what might be their final stand. "Martinez," Mitchell called to his radio man. "Any word from Corps?" The young soldier shook his head sadly. "Still getting fragments, Sarge. Sounds like Bastone's surrounded too, and the whole front's in chaos. But I did hear something about reinforcements moving up from the south." Major Thompson gathered the NCOs around his improvised command post. "Gentlemen, I won't lie to you about our situation. We're outnumbered at least 3-1. Our supply lines are cut, and German armor is closing in from multiple directions. But every hour we hold this position gives our forces time to reorganize and counterattack." He paused, looking each man in the eye. "I've received orders to hold Sanctivith as long as militarily feasible. It means we fight until we can't fight. Any more? Then we fight some more." Outside, German artillery began registering on targets throughout the town. The methodical bombardment suggested the enemy was preparing for a coordinated assault designed to end resistance quickly and decisively. Mitchell gathered his remaining men around him. O'Sullivan, Martinez, and 6 other soldiers represented all that remained of his original squad. Their faces showed exhaustion, fear, and determination in equal measure. "Boys," he said quietly, "we didn't ask for this fight, but it's ours now. Remember your training, help your buddies, and make every shot count. We're American soldiers, and we don't give up." Through the basement walls, you could hear the growing rumble of approaching German tanks. December 19th, 1944 dawned gray and bitter across the embattled town of Sanctivith. Sergeant Mitchell had spent the night moving between defensive positions, checking on his men and coordinating with other squad leaders as German artillery steadily pounded their perimeter. At 0700 hours, the bombardment reached crescendo intensity. German 150mm howitzers systematically destroyed every building that might shelter American defenders, while mortars walked their deadly pattern through the streets. The ancient church that housed Major Thompson's command post took a direct hit, collapsing the bell tower onto the street below. "Here they come," shouted Private O'Sullivan from his position behind an overturned delivery truck. Through the smoke and snow, German infantry were advancing in squad-sized elements, using building-to-building tactics perfected during urban fighting on the Eastern Front. Mitchell adjusted his rifle sight and selected targets carefully. These weren't the green replacements or overage Volkssturm militia they'd encountered in previous battles. The soldiers advancing through Sankt Vith's rubble-strewn streets moved with professional competence. Their camouflaged uniforms and modern equipment marking them as first-line Wehrmacht troops. "Panzerfaust!" screamed someone from the 7th Armored Positions as a German soldier emerged from behind a demolished bakery. The distinctive silhouette of an anti-tank weapon visible on his shoulder, the rocket-propelled grenade streaked across the street, impacting against a Sherman tank's frontal armor with a tremendous explosion. "Master Sergeant?" Kowalski's voice carried over the gunfire from a position 2 blocks away. "They're flanking us through the cemetery. Need support on the north side?" Mitchell made a quick, tactical decision. "Martinez, O'Sullivan, with me. We're going to help Kowalski's boys before they get overrun." The 3 soldiers moved through the devastated streets using techniques learned through bitter experience. They bounded from cover to cover, using bomb craters and collapsed walls for concealment, while German machine guns swept the area with deadly precision. As they reached Kowalski's position, Mitchell could see the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. German assault troops had infiltrated the town's defensive perimeter at multiple points, forcing American defenders to fight in isolated pockets without central coordination. "Sarge," Martinez called out, pressing his radio headset against his ear. "I'm getting fragmentary transmissions from division. Sounds like they're ordering a general withdrawal to secondary positions west of town." The withdrawal order came none too soon. German Tiger tanks had finally negotiated the rubble-blocked streets and were positioning themselves to provide direct fire support for their infantry. The massive 56-ton vehicles represented firepower that American defenders simply couldn't match with their available weapons. Major Thompson peered through the smoke, his uniform torn and his face blackened with cordite residue. "All units commence withdrawal by phases. Maintain contact with the enemy while falling back to designated rally points." The retrograde movement through Sankt Vith became a running battle lasting 6 hours. American soldiers fought desperately to prevent German forces from turning their withdrawal into a complete rout. NCOs like Mitchell and Kowalski used every tactical trick they'd learned to keep their men organized and moving despite overwhelming enemy pressure. According to military historian Hugh Cole's official army history, the Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge. The defense of Sankt Vith delayed German timetables by crucial days, disrupting Wehrmacht plans for rapid exploitation of their initial breakthrough. By 1400 hours, the last American defenders had cleared Sankt Vith's eastern outskirts. Behind them, German forces were already moving equipment and supplies through the captured crossroads. But their advance had been delayed by precious hours that would prove decisive in the coming days. Private O'Sullivan stumbled as they reached the rally point, blood seeping through a hastily applied field dressing on his left leg. "Sarge, I ain't sure how much more of this I can take." Mitchell helped the young soldier to a medic station established in a grove of pine trees. Around them, the remnants of multiple American units were reorganizing under the direction of surviving officers and NCOs. "You've done good, Danny," Mitchell told him quietly. "Real good. Every German we stopped in that town is one less Jerry shooting at our boys somewhere else." As darkness fell across the Ardennes, Mitchell looked back toward Sankt Vith's burning buildings. They'd lost the town, but they'd sold it dearly. The question now was whether American forces could rally sufficiently to stop the German offensive before it reached its objectives. In the distance, artillery rumbled ominously as the battle shifted to new ground. December 22nd, 1944, brought the first clear skies the Ardennes had seen since the German offensive began. And with them came the drone of Allied aircraft returning to the battle. Sergeant Mitchell watched from his foxhole as P-47 Thunderbolts streaked overhead, their rockets and machine guns finally able to strike German armor columns that had operated with impunity during the previous week's overcast weather. Mitchell's depleted squad had joined a hastily organized defensive line north of Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was conducting its legendary defense of that crucial road junction. The paratroopers' stubborn resistance had become a rallying point for American forces throughout the salient, proving that German momentum could be stopped. "Look at those beautiful birds go," exclaimed Private Martinez, watching as a flight of Pi-51 Mustangs dove on a German supply column visible in the distance. Black smoke marked the destruction of Wehrmacht fuel trucks and ammunition carriers. Resources the Germans could ill afford to lose. Lieutenant Crawford, now commanding what remained of their company, studied intelligence reports that painted an increasingly optimistic picture. "Gentlemen, it appears the German offensive has culminated. Third Army's moving north from Luxembourg, and First Army stabilizing their positions throughout the sector. The change in circumstances was dramatic and encouraging. German forces that had advanced with confidence a week earlier were now fighting desperately to maintain their gains against growing American pressure. Fuel shortages were forcing Wehrmacht units to abandon vehicles, while constant air attacks disrupted their supply lines. Master Sergeant Kowalski joined Mitchell at the forward observation post they'd established in a demolished farmhouse. His weathered face showed cautious optimism for the first time since the offensive began. "Krauts tried to take Hill 312 again this morning. Lost to tanks and about a platoon of infantry? They're not pushing as hard as they were." Mitchell nodded, studying German positions through his binoculars. "Enemy soldiers were digging defensive positions rather than preparing for assault, eh? Clear indication that their offensive capability was diminishing." The Wehrmacht units visible across the snowy landscape showed signs of exhaustion and demoralization. Martinez Mitchell called to his radio man. "What's the latest from division?" The young soldier consulted his message log, his face breaking into the first genuine smile Mitchell had seen from him in days. "General Patton's boys are making good progress from the south. Sarge, sounds like they might break through to Bastogne within 48 hours. The mention of Patton's Third Army brought cheers from other soldiers within hearing distance. The legendary general's reputation for aggressive offensive action had made him a hero to frontline troops, and his rapid redeployment from the Saar region to the Ardennes demonstrated the kind of flexibility that would ultimately defeat German ambitions. As referenced in Martin Blumenson's comprehensive study Patton, the man behind the legend, the Third Army's 90-degree pivot north represented one of the most impressive logistical achievements of the European campaign. Private O'Sullivan had returned from the field hospital, his leg wound properly treated and his spirits restored by news of American reinforcements. "Sarge, medics say German prisoners are talking about fuel shortages and supply problems. Sounds like their big push is running out of steam." Mitchell felt a cautious optimism building among his men. The desperate fear that had characterized the first days of the offensive was being replaced by professional confidence, as American forces regained their balance and began coordinating effective countermeasures. Captain Hayes arrived with orders that confirmed Mitchell's assessment of changing circumstances. "Sergeant, we're being attached to Combat Command Baker for a limited offensive operation tomorrow morning. Objective is to retake the high ground overlooking the Salm River Valley." The prospect of offensive action, rather than desperate defense, marked a psychological turning point for Mitchell's squad. They'd survived the worst of the German onslaught and were ready to start pushing back. The young soldiers who'd been terrified a week earlier now showed the quiet confidence of combat veterans. "All right, boys," Mitchell addressed his men as they prepared for the coming operation. "We've been through hell and come out the other side. Tomorrow we start paying the Krauts back for what they put us through." Outside their positions, American artillery was registering on German targets with increasing frequency and accuracy. The sound of outgoing rounds provided a comforting counterpoint to the incoming fire they'd endured for so long. As Christmas Eve approached in the Ardennes, the tide of battle was clearly turning in favor of Allied forces. Christmas Eve 1944 arrived with fresh snow falling across the Ardennes and the sound of American artillery pounding German positions with methodical precision. Sergeant Mitchell checked his watch in the gray pre-dawn light. 05:30 hours. 30 minutes before their attack on Hill 312 was scheduled to commence, his squad had been reinforced with replacements from the States, young soldiers, whose clean uniforms and nervous energy contrasted sharply with the battle-hardened veterans who'd survived the German offensive. Mitchell felt protective of these new men, remembering his own first taste of combat and the NCOs who'd kept him alive long enough to learn. Remember what I told you? He addressed the replacements quietly. Stay low, move fast, and follow the veterans. They'll keep you alive if you listen to them. Private First Class Tommy Chen, a Chinese-American soldier from San Francisco's Chinatown, nodded seriously while checking his rifle for the third time. Next to him, Private Robert Jackson from Alabama worked nervously with a cigarette he couldn't light in the falling snow. The artillery preparation intensified at 0-5-50-5 hours, with 105mm howitzers walking their fire across German defensive positions on the hillside above them. Mitchell had requested extra smoke rounds to conceal their advanced lessons learned during the bitter fighting of the past week. "Fix bayonets," called Lieutenant Crawford, as the bombardment reached its crescendo. The metallic sound of blades locking onto rifle muzzles echoed along the American line, a sound that had preceded infantry assaults for generations. At exactly 0600 hours, whistles blew, and American soldiers rose from their positions to begin the assault. Mitchell led his squad forward through the snow-covered field. Using tactical movement techniques perfected during months of combat across Europe, German resistance was immediate, but less intense than expected. Machine gun positions that should have swept the assault area with deadly fire were either unmanned or responded with sporadic, poorly aimed bursts. The Wehrmacht troops defending Hill 312 appeared exhausted and demoralized. "They're pulling back," shouted Master Sergeant Kowalski from the left flank of the attack. German soldiers were indeed withdrawing from their forward positions, conducting a fighting retreat towards secondary defensive lines higher on the hillside. Mitchell's squad reached the first German trench system after 20 minutes of steady advance. The positions showed signs of hasty abandonment, personal equipment scattered in the mud, ammunition boxes left half empty, field telephone lines cut by retreating soldiers. Private Martinez called out excitedly, "Sarge, I'm intercepting German radio traffic. Sounds like they're requesting permission to withdraw to the west wall." The significance of this intelligence wasn't lost on Mitchell. German forces were already planning retreats to their original defensive positions. The Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. Hitler's gamble had failed, and Wehrmacht units throughout the salient would soon be fighting desperately to avoid encirclement. As documented in Robert Merriam's classic account Dark December, German forces began withdrawing from the Ardennes salient on Christmas Day, 1944. Marking the definitive failure of Operation Watch on Rhine. The assault on Hill 312 succeeded beyond expectations, with American forces securing their objectives by noon with surprisingly light casualties. German defenders had conducted only token resistance before withdrawing 2 positions further east. Private O'Sullivan, serving as acting squad leader for one of the replacement groups, demonstrated the leadership skills he'd developed during the crisis. "Keep spread out and watch for mines," he called to his men. "Krauts like to leave surprises when they pull back." From their new positions on the hilltop, Mitchell could observe German forces retreating throughout the valley below. Long columns of vehicles and troops moved eastward, their orderly withdrawal suggesting command control, but also indicating strategic defeat. Captain Hayes, "Gentlemen, 25th Army Group, reports German forces are conducting general withdrawal throughout the salient. Our job now is to maintain contact and pressure while avoiding unnecessary casualties." The Christmas Eve counterattack had succeeded beyond their most optimistic expectations. German forces that had seemed invincible a week earlier were now retreating in the face of American pressure. Their offensive capability broken by stubborn defense and effective carcan as snow continued falling across the Ardennes battlefield. Mitchell felt cautious satisfaction at their survival and success. They'd faced the worst the Wehrmacht could throw at them and emerged victorious, though the cost in casualties and suffering would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. Private Chen approached Mitchell as they consolidated their positions. "Sergeant, what happens now?" Mitchell looked eastward toward Germany, where the war would continue for several more months. "Now we keep pushing, son, all the way to Berlin." January 3rd, 1945, marked the official end of the Battle of the Bulge. Though Sergeant Mitchell's squad continued pursuing retreating German forces eastward through the frozen Ardennes landscape, The Wehrmacht's great gamble had cost them irreplaceable reserves and equipment, hastening the collapse that would come 3 months later with Germany's unconditional surrender. Mitchell stood in the ruins of Sankt Vith, captured by American forces, after fierce fighting, surveying the destruction that marked one of the most crucial battles in European history. The town's strategic crossroads, contested so desperately 2 weeks earlier, now swarmed with American supply trucks and reinforcements moving toward the German border. Hard to believe we were fighting for our lives in this place just a couple weeks ago, observed Private O'Sullivan, who'd been promoted to corporal after demonstrating exceptional leadership during the crisis. His wounded leg still bothered him, but he'd refused evacuation to remain with his squad. The human cost of the battle was staggering. American casualties exceeded 80,000 killed, wounded, and missing, while German losses approached 100,000. Its entire divisions on both sides had been shattered by the intensity of combat in the worst winter conditions Europe had seen in decades. Master Sergeant Kowalski emerged from what had been the church basement where they'd planned their desperate defense. Found some interesting souvenirs down there, Sarge. German maps showing their original objectives. They really thought they could reach Antwerp. Mitchell examined the captured documents with professional interest. Wehrmacht planners had been incredibly ambitious, envisioning a breakthrough that would split Allied armies and potentially force a negotiated settlement. The failure of Operation Watch on Rhine had instead sealed Germany's fate by consuming reserves needed for defending the fatherland itself. Lieutenant Crawford, now promoted to captain and commanding their composite company, gathered the NCOs for a final briefing before their movement toward the Siegfried Line. Gentlemen, divisions received orders to continue the advance into Germany proper. The Krauts are finished as an offensive force, but they'll fight hard defending their homeland. Private Martinez, whose radio work had proved invaluable throughout the battle, shared intelligence intercepts that painted a picture of German collapse. Their communications are in chaos, sir. Units reporting fuel shortages, ammunition problems, and massive desertion rates. The replacements who joined them during the counteroffensive had proved themselves in combat and earned the respect of veteran soldiers. Private Chen had demonstrated particular courage during a night patrol, while Private Jackson had shown remarkable skill with the Browning automatic rifle. As referenced in Charles Whiting's detailed study, The Battle of Hurtgen Forest, American forces had learned valuable lessons during the Ardennes fighting that would serve them well during the final campaigns of the European War. "What's our next objective, Captain?" asked Corporal O'Sullivan, studying the tactical map spread across a makeshift table constructed from ammunition boxes. "We're attached to 9th Army for the drive to the Rhine River," Crawford replied. "Intelligence estimates German resistance will be sporadic, but potentially fierce around major urban areas." Mitchell felt mixed emotions as they prepared to leave the Ardennes battlefield. Pride in their accomplishment was tempered by sadness for the friends they'd lost and the knowledge that more fighting lay ahead. The young soldiers who'd faced their first combat during the German offensive had been transformed by the experience into seasoned veterans. The Battle of the Bulge had been Hitler's last great gamble, a desperate attempt to reverse Germany's deteriorating strategic situation through audacious offensive action. Its failure had consumed Wehrmacht reserves that might have prolonged the war by months, instead hastening the Reich's collapse. "Boys," Mitchell addressed his squad as they loaded their equipment for movement eastward, "we've been through something that'll be remembered long after we're gone. You fought like hell when things looked hopeless, and you helped win one of the most important battles in American history." Private Chen raised his hand tentatively. "Sergeant, do you think the war will be over soon?" Mitchell looked eastward, toward Germany, where smoke columns still marked the positions of retreating Wehrmacht units. "Sooner than it would have been if we hadn't stopped them here, son. Sooner." As their convoy moved through the liberated Belgian countryside, Mitchell reflected on the lessons learned during those desperate December days. American soldiers had proved they could face the worst circumstances and emerge victorious through courage, determination, and mutual support. The Battle of the Bulge was over, but its legacy would endure as long as free people remembered those who stood against tyranny in humanity's darkest hour. This story draws upon extensive historical documentation from military archives, veteran testimonials, and scholarly works, including those referenced throughout the narrative, presenting the human experience of one of World War II's most significant battles through the eyes of the soldiers who fought it.